This special episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you without commercial interruption by Getty's Bike Tours. The best way to see the battlefield since 2005 has been by bike. That's a scientific fact. And Getty's Bike Tours provides the best bicycle tours in town. In fact, they provide the only bicycle tours in town. So call 717-752-7752 and let them know that you're a listener of Addressing Gettysburg and book a tour today. Listeners get a 15% discount. That's 717-752-7752. Now, on with the show.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this anniversary episode of Addressing Gettysburg. This is the July 4th episode, and today we are dealing with what little military actions there were on the 4th compared to the rest of the battle, and also the aftermath from a medical perspective. And we're recording once again from inside the barn out at the Spangler farm. And before we get to the history here, I want to introduce Paul Simonik. He is the Spangler Farm site coordinator. And I thought we'd talk a little bit about what you guys do out here. Paul, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
We appreciate you letting us do this. I mean, it's perfect day today. It's a nice breeze. It's not hot. It's wonderful. But you had nothing to do with that.
I work with the chamber a lot.
So tell us a little bit about what you guys do out here.
Well, what we have here is the George Spangler Farm and Field Hospital. And this was the site of the Union 11th Corps Field Hospital. And the Gettysburg Foundation purchased the property in 2008. And it's been an ongoing process of loving restoration from the very first day. We managed to restore the barn, the smokehouse, the summer kitchen, and we've done a lot of work, with the farmhouse itself. And we were able to open it up to the public and tell a little bit different side of the Civil War story and the Battle of Gettysburg. Because I think for so many years we've talked about the colonels, the generals, the cannons, the guns, which is important. But with the Spangler Farm, it gives us the opportunity to talk about people, everyday people, the effect of the civilians and the medical personnel. Plus, we get to tell the story of the common, ordinary soldier, which is an expression I've always hated, because there's nothing common nor ordinary about someone that volunteers to have you be shot at.
Yeah, good point.
So that's very uncommon in my world.
They're extraordinary.
So again, it gives us a chance to invite the public out here and tell a little bit different side of the American Civil War, and specifically the Battle of Gettysburg.
Who was this in private hands before you guys got a hold of it?
Yes, the Spanglers. It was in the Spanglers' hands, so about 1911, and then there was a series of owners, from 1911. And then in 1953, a family by the name of Andrew purchased the property, and then we, in effect, purchased it from them in 2008.
Oh, wow, okay. And what was the condition of the barn when you got it?
Different. I think if anybody's seen before and after photographs, they would agree that it looks a lot different and a lot better now. I remember when we purchased the property, one of the big concerns was, and again, I apologize, I never can remember this hurricane, but a tail end of a particular hurricane came through the area, and there was great concern about the barn being blown down. There was no problem. There were so many holes in the barn, the wind just went right through it.
Yeah.
So again, this is it was a lot of work and a lot of generosity from our donors and benefactors and supporters, because again, being a foundation, we rely on the support of our members to make things happen.
Okay, good. Now, people, if they want to come check this place out, they just can't pull up and go see it like they might think. So how do people go about finding out when they can come here?
Well, the easiest way to do it, we're open every weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from June 10th up until the second weekend of August. And if they go to the Visitor Center and they purchase a ticket for the Cyclorama, the movie, and the museum, they can get a free ticket, a shuttle ticket to come out here.
Oh.
And access is by shuttle, to save wear and tear on the property, and quite frankly, safety too, because access is from a one-lane road, and it can get a little bit hairy when you got people coming and going.
Yes, absolutely.
But again, they can come out here really for no cost, based on that.
Okay, good. Well, Paul, thank you very much for talking to us about this, and thank you for letting us in here. We promise we won't destroy it.
I have great faith in all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Joining us to talk about the history of all of this is all three of them are people that you know from the show. You've heard them before. Ron Kirkwood, who wrote Too Much for Human Endurance. Thanks, Paul, for Too Much for Human Endurance. We've had him on last year. And our buddies Fran Feyock and Rick Shroeder, licensed battlefield guides extraordinaire. And they're here, and we're going to talk about medical. I mean, who else would we get to talk about medical than these two characters? Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's get, first let's start by wrapping up the battle. We've had 3 anniversary episodes out so far that, well, of course not by today, but by the time people will hear this, that talk about the battle. And not everybody realizes that there was still some fighting going on the 4th, although nothing like we've seen for the previous 3 days. But give us a little bit of an idea. Go ahead, Fran.
Well, first of all, the battle continues through July 3rd a little bit in the evening. Mm-hmm. And it's times are hard to figure out exact times, but we're going to have a weather change here on July 4th.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to start to get heavy rains that are going to change the whole complexion of the battlefield. We've talked before about just the sheer amount of man and willpower it'll take to move large armies in the Civil War. Now think about an army, the Confederate Army particularly, that has to exit this battlefield in a blinding rainstorm when they're disorganized. People who were here 3 days ago aren't here. Think about just the sheer job that they have to do to get out of here. And Robert Edward Lee is finally going to step up to the plate here now and start to issue exact and specific orders. He's going to bring up John M. Bowdoin, and he's kind of done with the I just place the men in position and let God's will. No, God's will is going to be a pencil in his hand, and he's going to send specific requirements to get these wounded soldiers out of here. 17 miles long, we tell you, is his wounded train of soldiers. He has to take them back. He's got to take them back. The
Right.
South is running out of everything, especially young men that can fight. We were told that before he left to come up here, he asked the Confederates how many 18-year-olds will appear in the Confederate States next year. He was told under 3,000. The biggest munition that he can't replace on this battlefield are young men that can carry guns. So the action on July 4th is him getting ready to retreat. What do you think, Rick?
Well, and also the Confederates kind of unwind their line. They've got kind of a longer fishhook that corresponds with the Union line, and they uncurl that, and Ewell draws his Second Corps back to make a big, long, straight line out to the west of town, and that's where they start to funnel into and onto the Chambersburg Pike, the Fairfield Road, and some of the units head south. But by the time it starts to pour down rain on July 4th, the Confederates are in pretty much one long straight line, getting ready to get out of Dodge.
Out on Seminary Ridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You also have Confederate snipers on July 4th
Yes.
that are quite active.
Yes.
The Union is trying to bury the dead at the end of the Pickett's Charge site, and they're getting shot at from the trees on the other side of the charge. And one of General Howard's staffers was mortally wounded on July 4th on the west, about by the seminary. So they were still pretty active with
Yeah,
this.
so men are dying still on July 4th. Few and far between, but still dead is dead.
That's
And
true.
Julia Jacobs is one of the stories Susan Stramella tells. There's a barricade set up on Middle Street, and the Confederates are setting up a trap for the Union Army as they come forward, and she's standing in her archway with a white, trying to tell the Union Army to come be careful. They're setting a trap for you. So the town's barricaded. The Confederates, I think Lee's doing probably his best job of being very dogmatic. You will go here. This is what you'll do.
Right.
And they're getting ready to get out. And I think he's giving his ambulance trains an opportunity to get a head start. Now remember, these are ambulances. We're looking at one here in the Spangler Barn
Right.
that
Yep,
has
yep.
springs. I'm pretty sure his didn't have springs.
I'm sure they weren't all technically ambulances
They were.
either.
That's right.
They
Yeah.
were wagons.
Wagons,
Yeah.
Some of them
limbers,
covered, some of them not.
caissons. And I don't know, Rick, what do you think about the screams of those men with wounds like we know that he's taking out of here? And how about the dreaded decision of who you're going to say you're not coming home with us.
I mean, Imboden has a fantastic quote when he reads about this, or he talks about this wagon train of misery and how the cries and screams of the soldiers, shoot me, put me out of my misery, oh my God, what's going to happen to my wife and children. That all resonates with Imboden, and he's very specific about what he's seeing and hearing. And unfortunately, the death is going to continue on that wagon train out of Gettysburg, 17 miles long. He takes, I think, 7,000 with him and leaves 14,000 behind. I may have that backwards, but there's thousands of Confederates too badly injured
to move. Yeah.
6,000 Confederates were left behind, and
Okay, so
14,000 Union
Union,
were left
right.
behind.
So Rick, you were a bone doctor.
Yes, I was.
Still is.
Still are. You
Not
are?
practicing.
No, you're not
Not
practicing.
practicing,
Yeah.
right.
Okay. How painful is it when you have a broken bone when it rubs on its other part?
Yeah, in medicine, we use terminology that we know the lay people won't understand. That's how doctors
You do that on
function.
purpose.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
You can bill more for it.
Otherwise, you know what we were saying. That term is called crepitus. That means rubbing of the bone.
Okay.
And it's really painful. The lining over the bone is where all the nerve endings are. And when you have a broken bone, between the bleeding at the area of the fracture and the swelling and then the bone rubbing on each other. And if anybody's ever sustained a displaced broken bone, a major bone, I mean, you'll feel the grinding and you'll feel the crepitus back and forth.
You can hear it too.
Yeah, and you can feel
fun.
it when you set a fracture, but it's really painful.
When you say the nerve endings that cover the bone, so the bone itself doesn't feel anything, but there's nerve endings on the bone?
Yeah, not to get too technical about it, but the
By all
bone
means.
does have nerve endings, but it's the lining over the bone that has a lot of the blood supply and the nerves, and that's torn, of course, when you break a bone and it's displaced, and that, among other causes, is why it's so painful. And it's really painful.
Right, and Civil War bullets, they're going to shatter bones.
And not just shatter the bones, but destroy the soft tissue around it. The muscles are badly damaged. Blood vessels may be injured. Nerves may be injured. These soft lead 58 caliber mini balls are tearing extremities apart.
Yeah. So when you're in a wagon on a dirt road that has no springs, no shocks, nothing like that, that's the painful. It's slipping and sliding.
And you're wearing
God.
your uniform that's got caked and clotted blood on it and is about as hard as his tabletop. Yeah, it's a pretty oppressive situation.
And
Yeah.
the emotional baggage of who's in that wagon case on with you, and that the enemy is probably pursuing you. I can't imagine that rumors aren't just running rampant through these Confederates as they're going out. We talked about this in our first podcast. People tend to think that when a bullet strikes tissue, that it just kills where it goes in. But we told you it's like a bullseye. Remember, there's like the center of the bullseye where it's dead, but then there's the next ring where it's hypoperfused. That's where the pain is, and then there's all this. These poor Confederates. That's all you can think about. And not to mention the doctors. Rick, what do you think about the doctors going through and maybe a conscious soldier saying, please, sir, take me home, and saying, no, sir, you're going to stay here?
I think in our first podcast, we talked about the triage system.
Yes.
The Confederates were basically doing the same thing on trying to decide who's stable enough to go and who's so unstable that we have to leave them behind. And many of those Confederates were cared for by medical staff on the Union side, but the Confederates left behind medical staff too. Ron, were there Confederate surgeons here at the Spangler Barn? They were all Union surgeons.
All Union.
Yeah, but I know that at the seminary, for instance, there were both Confederate and Union surgeons working there.
Yeah. So if you had the choice of being in Lee's train or being here at the Spangler Farm on July 4th and thereafter, where would you rather be?
That's easy.
That's
I'd rather
easy.
be here.
You'd rather be here.
I don't
Although the
want-
misery factor here, though, was on the 4th and the 5th were that was the peak.
Right, and that's what I want you to get into. So even though it's better than being jostled around in a wagon and perhaps chased down by cavalry or whatever, it wasn't Club Med here at the Spangler Farm.
No, the 11th Corps had 100 ambulances, and they were all out on the 4th and the 5th because many of the Union wounded were trapped behind Confederate lines. Once the Confederates retreated, they can go out and get them. So the Sanitary Commission said there were 1,900 wounded guys here on the 5th. That was the peak. Christian Commission said 1,800. So they don't have enough tents. They don't have enough food. Tents are just starting to arrive. It's raining. It's raining like crazy. One guy said it was the worst flood since Noah on the 4th, Spangler patient. They're out in it. The misery, they're wounded. They're lying in puddles. It was really, really bad here.
Now, the lack of tents and other supplies, is that because Meade ordered all of the supply trains to be...
Hancock ordered the medical supply trains back to Taneytown, and then Meade ordered them back to Westminster because, they wanted to keep the roads clear so that for fast troop movement. But when they did, and that makes perfect sense, but that means that they just had enough medicine to do an amputation. They had the anesthesia, they had their equipment, but they didn't have any bedding, they didn't have any food, they didn't have any tents, so they just set them out of the way someplace.
That's
Ron, as
miserable.
big as this barn is, I mean, we're on the top floor. What could you get in here? 200 people?
Well,
like if you had to really use this, you could get 200, and you're telling me there's 1,900. I don't know. How many?
Yeah.
1,900 at the same time. We're not down total
Here.
over time. This is
Here.
at one
On
point.
that day.
on the 4th
If you
and the
counted
5th.
them up.
Right.
Yes. Now, I have one doctor in the book that said there were 500 people in the barn. I have another doctor that said there were 400 people in the barn. And so here we are in the barn. This is their threshing floor with a wall in the middle. They had their heads up on the middle wall and their feet out here. Same thing over here, same thing over there. They're too close. They're shoulder to shoulder. They're spreading diseases around. 500 and 400 sounds like a lot because the stable downstairs isn't going to hold many.
What are the dimensions of this? I don't even know.
I can't remember off the
I'm
top
gonna
of my
say
head. It's big.
It's big, but not.
It's a big Pennsylvania
not
bank.
1,900 big.
You got the hay mows on each side. You do need room in between each person to be able to walk through and treat them.
Right. But this is also a very clean barn today. It's not being used for its purpose. But in the Civil War, during the battle, it was being used for its purpose. So down in the stables, you have horse crap and urine in the mud and everything. And up here, God knows what the hell. Yeah.
Thank God it's a podcast. You just didn't see Rick and I go. You didn't see Paul.
But really, I mean, guys, from a medical point of view, though, you got all these guys, as he said, shoulder to shoulder. They're laying on dirty floors. They didn't have time to clean out the barn and everything like that.
And what are the flies doing?
They're spreading it.
They're loving it.
Yeah.
There's a lot to eat here.
Yeah. Farmers are naturally going to attract flies, but then you add blood and amputated limbs. I mean, imagine the Spanglers, George and Elizabeth Spangler, and their 4 kids. They're in one upstairs bedroom. The rest of their house is occupied by wounded and dying Union officers. It's 80 degrees, 90 degrees. It's hot in Gettysburg in July. They have a window open. There's no screens back in the day. They probably had chamber pots in there. Imagine the flies just in their room.
Yeah.
What they had to live through. Incessant flies.
The civilians in Gettysburg and the surgeons here talk about how hard it was to inhale and not inhale
Flies.
Yeah, blowflies. Many of them wore masks. Not the surgeons, like we associate today,
Right.
but they wore masks just to keep the insects out of their mouth.
And as time went on, they would dip it in some kind of oil to cover the smells.
Eucalyptus or mint. Peppermint.
They also were wearing masks in town, weren't they, because of the smell of the horses?
Yes.
The dead horses on the battlefield.
The stench in this community had to have been incredible.
This weather it's exactly the opposite of trying to preserve a human body it's the exact opposite, where you would say, oh, if it got cold, and it didn't. It was hot. That's why there's so many unknown soldiers, because you can't identify the bodies from the blackening and the bloating and the disfiguration.
After one day, they're already bloated out there on the battlefield in that sun.
That's right.
So, in other words, decomposition happens faster, is what you're saying.
And
in the
that's
heat.
with every horse's people.
Yeah.
And they turn black. The bodies turn black.
So there, of course, the Spangler Farm isn't the only hospital. I think everybody listening understands that. But in case you don't know that, there's many hospitals around here. Most hospitals, what would they use for hospitals back then? Barns.
Yeah. To be a division field hospital, which, again, just real briefly, there's a 3-stage triage system here that Dr. Letterman puts into place. The field aid station is like the ambulance without wheels out on the battlefield, rendering immediate first aid and triaging people into groups as to who's going to the hospital to have a surgery, most likely an amputation, at the next level of care. And that's what this building is. It's the division field hospital for the 11th Corps for the Union Army. Once people are stabilized enough to be moved again from here, whether that's 2 days or 2 months, they're going to be transferred to a general hospital in Philadelphia, in York, in Baltimore, or right across from Hoss's at Camp Letterman here in Gettysburg on Route 30, where there's a 4,000-bed general hospital that's open for 4 months.
And a salad bar right across the street.
That's right.
Yeah, but for anything to be a hospital with this level of casualties, all you needed was roads and water and a place for any type of shelter. That's why all the churches become hospitals, the buildings on the Pennsylvania College and the seminary. This, I can't even imagine it. And so much so, and I was just showing Rick before we started, the Union Army must be feeling this pressure too. I hope Jonathan Letterman is now being heard, because I found one line in here on July 5th, 1863 from Seth Williams.
Yeah, he was
the adjutant general.
Right.
He's telling all these where to move. This corps will go here, this corps will go there, but there's one line. The medical director will establish a general hospital at Gettysburg for the wounded that cannot be moved away from the Army. That's unprecedented.
That's from the official records.
That's from the official records. That's unheard of. That they're not. They realized, or somebody has impressed upon them, you can't move these people to York. They're not
right
stable.
Away. Not right away.
Right.
And you're right, Matt. There are many locations not too far from here. If you go out the driveway and turn right, you're going to be on Hospital Road. And Hospital Road is named for the Union hospitals that were established at many of these farms and barns, which would have been very similar to this one. In other words, livestock was just moved out, and it's not a great place to lay with an open wound.
The key difference about this hospital, it was a Corps hospital. It started as a 2nd Division hospital, but it had all 3 divisions of the 11th Corps here. So there were more men here. And I think just about all the other main ones were division hospitals, weren't they?
Yeah.
Now they Spanglers also had a quarter of a mile in the middle of their farm. They had a 2nd Corps 1st Division hospital. The guys who fought at the wheat field in Rose Woods, where did they go? They came to the George Spangler farm here. So the Spanglers had almost 3,000 wounded men on their farm, which was bigger than the population of Gettysburg at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, but a lot of that has to do with location, I'm guessing, right? I mean, you've got roads that kind of filter in here, and we're right behind the line. And it's hard, as I'm looking out this door now, it's hard to imagine, but when we had you on last time, Ron, we were talking about how men watched pickets charge from here, which, we look and there's a line of trees. I can't see a thing out there, so it's hard to imagine. Yeah. So it's very close. Just kind of rewinding a little bit to July 3rd, were there any overshoots, and did that cause any problems?
They evacuated the barn.
Oh, they did?
Because the shots were landing within 20 feet of the barn. I'm sure the Spanglers saw it all from their bedroom window. They could see the shells coming in. They were worried that the Confederates were breaking through, and they were lining up soldiers around here and getting cannon here to defend them. But yeah, this whole farm was hit by shells so badly that they moved wounded out there. And Surgeon Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York was doing an amputation out in front, and they called it off. I mean, they completed the amputation, and then there's a stone wall in the back of the stable, and they just kind of huddled under there till they felt like they were safe again.
Wait, Rick, they canceled a surgery?
Yeah.
I hate when that happens.
I hate when that happens.
We're about 2 miles from Seminary Ridge, aren't we? And so the
Yeah.
Confederate artillery's outer range would be here.
Especially because a lot of those artillery, they were on Emmitsburg Road.
That's right.
Yeah.
They weren't all the way back at Henry
they're up
Spangler.
to the Beach Orchard, and they're,
So,
that's
and
right.
they can't see it. It's humid. There's so
Right.
many cannons.
So
and
much smoke. Right.
And this got hit pretty badly here, just like Meade's headquarters on the Tawnytown Road did.
One of the, I think, really intriguing stories about the hospitals here is, the hospital in theory should be out of range of the enemy.
Right.
In theory.
In theory.
On the night of July 2nd, the 2nd Corps hospitals were on the
are in the
Tawnytown
range.
Road.
Yes,
Right.
they
And
are.
they were well within range of the enemy. And so, if you remember the show MASH about the term, we got to bug out, the 2nd Corps hospitals bugged out on the night of July 2nd and moved over near where the current outlets are to
Yeah.
the Schwartz farm in the middle of the battle. They had to I guess Granite Schoolhouse
July
didn't
3rd.
leave.
On the 3rd, they did.
They did.
Although they left a few guys who they didn't feel like they could be moved, and they were there till the 4th or died there.
But in the middle of this battle on the night of July 2nd, 2 very busy hospitals and part of a third are all being relocated. What's that, 3 or 4 miles to the
Yeah, I mean, that's a good
the east
distance
of
down by the
here.
And
outlets.
because Rick and I are from Johnstown, onto a floodplain.
That's true.
And as they're
We're
trying
a
to,
little sensitive to floodplains.
We are.
they're trying to evacuate those hospitals on the Tawnytown Road, but you have hundreds or thousands of men retreating and running for their lives at the same time, and it's just gridlock
I
on there, and
can't imagine.
they can't move the ambulances much at all.
Now, why then? I guess this wasn't as close, and that's why they didn't move this
little farther
hospital.
back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's far enough.
Just far enough.
Just far.
Yeah. Okay. So it's the 11th Corps Hospital. How long are men here for?
Men are here for 5 weeks
5
and 2
weeks.
days. That's how long the Spanglers were banned to an upstairs bedroom. They really started moving them out, men who could be moved on July 7th when most of the bridges were repaired and the railroad was functioning again. And so from that, 1900 was the peak on July 5th, and it just kept going down every day. Some guys walked to this train station, some guys got a ambulance ride, some farmers took them. So every day, there was a group of 500 that went to Baltimore on the train. There was another group, I think, Dr. Hubbard said 800. So by
they were getting rid of-
mid-July,
yeah.
there was probably 40, 50, 60 Confederates here. By mid-July, all Confederates are gone. And then every day it goes down till July 6th, the night they're all gone.
The idea is to get people out of here as fast as possible, but not jeopardize their lives
Yes.
Right.
by transporting them prematurely.
And just because they were transported, they were able to be transported, that didn't mean that they lived.
Right.
Many of them died at the hospitals that they were transferred to.
Jonathan Letterman was adamant about families coming to this battlefield and taking their wounded family members home. He thought it was very much to the detriment of the injured because, again, they're being moved too soon before they're stable enough to suffer the issues that go along with that journey.
And you're saying that the family coming to get them would be better.
No, it would be worse.
It would be worse.
Letterman wanted these guys to stay
To
put,
stay, okay.
to get ongoing medical care, and the families, of course, got here and they just wanted their loved one home
Right.
in their house.
They wanted to nurse their son or
Yes.
whatever.
The same thing
Yeah.
applied to the dead ones, the burials. They would come and families would come and exhume them. They came from Ohio here to Spangler and exhume them and take them home on the train to bury them in Ohio. The military banned that third week or so of July. Everybody was going to stay here.
I would think that would be a gamey situation.
Gamey. You mentioned earlier before, Ron, the bridges being repaired and all that stuff. And then, so Early and his men burned the railroad bridge that goes over Rock Creek
They
east
just
of
fixed that
town.
a couple years ago.
The construction just went down.
They just finished that a couple of years ago, right? Ron?
Better late than
bridge.
never. But so when before they had that bridge repaired, though, they wouldn't pick up men from the train station, would they?
No.
They would right across from Letterman, right?
Right, but before Letterman was there, but yeah, that's where they came.
Okay.
And once the bridge was repaired, They picked them up at the train station, and the Sanitary Commission set up a hospital across the tracks. It's like an open field or parking lot there right now. And they
Like
had-
some Arby's, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, downtown at the railroad station where they set up, there's a train station, there's the tracks, and then there's a parking lot or something. That was a Sanitary Commission tent. And the train only came in, I think, once a day. And so guys would get there and they'd have to spend the night.
And if they missed the train, they
they'd
would
take care of
Stuck,
them.
yeah.
They'd feed them and bed them and take care of them.
Well, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Ron's bringing up a really important point that everybody needs to understand. The absolutely essential role of the civilian support
was just
to the
gonna go
Army
there.
Medical Corps. Because the Army Medical Corps was hamstrung because of the orders. They didn't have supplies. Who had the supplies? Who brought the supplies? The Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission.
That's why we don't rely on government for things. So and then I wanted to get into that though. I read somewhere, it was one of the little boys who left accounts. I can't remember which one it was, I think, but he said that the people of Gettysburg probably would have died if it weren't for those civilian groups.
Sounds like you, Ziegler.
It might have been one of the McCready or McCurdy boys or whatever. But anyway, he basically said that they were out of water. The wells were either tapped or contaminated. You couldn't go to 7-Eleven and get bottled water because there was a hotel where the 7-Eleven is now, and Sheets wasn't around. So talk a little bit about that, because like you said, that's a big deal that the Christian Commission and the Sanitary Commission came in. What did they do?
One of the geological features that gets pointed out to me pretty regularly is the water availability in this area is not great. We got Rock Creek on one side and Marsh Creek on the other, but in beside we have these intermittent streams.
Yeah.
Right? Only 3 or 4 springs that we can count on. The wells require the aquifer to be filled, and they're being taken down. I don't know, Rick, how many gallons of urine do the horses put out every day?
I'd have
They
to look
take
that
it
up in my my special book.
So water is a problem. So I don't know. I guess they're bringing it in, but that's why a place like the Spangler Barn becomes so awesome, because it's got a ready water support.
Right.
Hummelbaugh Farm.
And every
Culp
day,
Farm. Yeah.
every day, these hospitals would send groups of people into town to the headquarters of the Christian Commission or the Sanitary Commission, and they would bring requisitions for supplies, and they would send them out here so that the men and the medical staff had material to take care of the wounded and the sick. People are still getting sick with medical diseases and not just wounds.
And before we go on here, gentlemen, can we award the Poor Bastard Award, the Poor Bastard of the Medical Care Award, to Dr. Henry Janes? There's a name you don't hear often. But Letterman's going to be out of here when, Rick?
When the Army leaves, Letterman's
going to leave,
yeah.
and he says,
That's his job.
He says,
Be with the
Dr.
Army."
Janes,
Yeah.
you're going to be in charge of this turmoil. And his first report is, when I first took over, there were over 60 field hospitals and soldiers arrayed around this town. People were moving back and forth. So his record is phenomenal. He's the surgeon of the 3rd Vermont, I think.
Yeah, he's from Vermont. Henry Janes.
Henry Janes.
Janes.
Yes,
Janes.
but I would tell you, he gets the You Poor Bastard Award because Letterman goes, okay, we brought 600 and some surgeons. How many am I going to leave you?
Yeah, maybe 100.
Maybe 100. Yeah.
And how many
And-
ambulances? I had 800 ambulances, and I'm going to leave less than 100.
Less than
wasn't
100.
it?
Yeah. And,
And then
hey,
he
have a
ran
good day.
Letterman, didn't he?
Yeah.
Wasn't he in charge
Yeah,
of Letterman?
Yeah, and he said, oh, by the way, on the 5th, we're ordered to set up a field hospital. It'd be nice if you named it after me.
The Sanitary and the Christian commissions had similar roles. The Sanitary Commission was formed actually by Congress, and they went around inspecting the hospitals, making sure they were okay and up to snuff. And they also solicited donations of food and clothing. Christian Commission, the Sanitary Commission paid their people. The Christian Commission was a voluntary organization. People would work for 6 weeks as nurses, help, whatever, run camps. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's brother, John, was here with the Christian Commission for six weeks. They submitted solicited donations as well. So in some points, they were battling for credit, battling for donations. The Christian Commission's main difference was they also tried to convert people. They had their Bibles, and they converted them to Christianity. But Gettysburg civilians, the Spanglers, do not survive here without those two commissions. Yeah. All of the Spanglers' crops, livestock, destroyed, taken. They have no food. And the commissions are here till the end of the year. So I'm sure they're being fed by these two commissions. And then after that, they probably left food for them for after that. And then the Spanglers are, again, because their farm is destroyed, they're probably, they're a modern family. They're buying food. Food is probably starting to come into town by then. They have family members, they have friends, and they're being given food later next year.
I can't imagine that for like the Spangler, and they're not the only family that was displaced or put out.
The Bliss family, whose dwellings are burned to the ground,
right?
Or others, the Harmons. I mean, I think we forget that these civilians' livelihoods were gone.
Yeah,
gone, and some of them could survive it. And some of them, like the Blisses, couldn't. They left.
Yeah, they moved.
So speaking of civilians, everybody knows Jenny Wade. She's just baking bread for the soldiers, and she was killed. And why the hell they were in that house, I don't know. But whatever, that's another show. But how about other civilians who were wounded during the battle, and some who were wounded or killed after the battle?
Well, I know that there was. And I can't tell you how many, Matt, but there was a group of mostly adolescent boys that encountered unexploded ordnance after the battle, trying to crack it open to get the lead out of there. And there are some pretty horrific stories of people getting killed. Sometimes the young man messing with the ordnance, and sometimes innocent bystanders.
Right.
So there were far more civilians killed in the subsequent weeks to the battle than during the 3 days of the battle.
Right. Yeah. Jenny gets all the attention because she was killed during the battle.
Right.
But to me, what's more tragic is the people who were killed after the battle. Because
especially if they were innocent bystanders.
Well, they were just innocent bystanders watching some idiot.
Ephraim Whistler, supposedly that's who died.
Well, Ephraim Whistler had the heart failure or whatever that was.
Went to bed and never got up again.
Yeah.
And if you were a civilian and you had wounded men or dying men in your house, you were suffering just from that too.
Yeah.
With the blood and the bodily fluids and the feces, and basically everything you have in your house is ruined. That happened to the Leitners, who owned part of Powers Hill with the Spanglers. Mrs. Leitner couldn't move back there after the hospital was cleaned out of their house. It was just too bad for her, and it made her sick, and so they moved away. It was just so bad in that house.
That must have been a tough job for the real estate agent to try to sell that house.
Lightly used. But diamond in the rough.
It's doing good business now, I'm happy to say.
But I will tell you, it's one of those stories we touch on. I'm a registered nurse. Rick's wife is a registered nurse. It's one of the untold stories that you don't hear. Females come here and they think, oh, this is all about males. I'm going to tell you, the heroines of this battle, it's not written about.
Right.
It's the Victorian era. What do you read that the women did? I made him soup. I put a cold rag on him. Give me a break. Rick and I have had the honor of taking nurses out on our medical tours here at the battlefield, and you just have to look at them and say, so what's the young men like when they're wounded? And you've got to take 5 minutes to get control of the audience. Mm-hmm. So these young women who are not supposed to see a naked man except for their brother and their husband now are holding these men over for dressing changes. They're getting groped, and they're getting touched, and they're getting blood and feces and urine on their clothing. But we don't hear about it.
Now, hold on.
The nuns, and I just say, you know what? It's the untold story of the nursing coming in, and they get 51,000 casualties is in a large part to the civilians who feed these men, who help change their dressings. They don't understand bugs and bacteria, but they understand cleanliness is next to godliness.
Right.
And I think that's a story that needs told.
But you said a couple things there, and you say the story needs to be told. So one of the things you said was they're getting groped. So are you saying that while the soldiers are laying there convalescing, they're still horny?
They're 23-year-old young men.
But I got a bullet in my thigh. I'm not thinking about the other parts of my body. I'm thinking about, getting that thigh.
Well, see, you need to spend it. For all the nurses, you may now comment on this and tell him, because you're right. When young men are sick,
Yeah.
they're sick. But when they start to get better,
They're not sick.
they're not sick.
Well, because we got all that pent up energy there.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
The comments I can almost feel.
I mean, I just find it hard to believe that, especially back then. I mean, today we have better medicine. You could have a ghastly wound and still be like, well, maybe you couldn't. I don't know. I've never been on this good medicine we have now, but I would imagine you maybe could get a little horny if you have a cute nurse today.
It's going to take a couple days from a pretty bad wound.
Thank
You're
you.
right.
That's my
Nobody
point.
with a broken femur is thinking along those lines for a couple days.
But there
anyway.
are some stories, though, of nurses marrying the guys they took care of,
After
or
he
the
dies.
the of
the guy dies, and when the brother comes to pick him up.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing is, there's it's still people still being people, even though it's this tragic.
Nursing as a profession didn't really exist much before the Civil War.
Okay.
And it was the women who volunteered, sometimes in groups like the Daughters of Charity down in Emmitsburg, who came up here. Sometimes Dorothea Dix and her plain Jane Brown and black dressed nurses. But sometimes it's just women who have the chutzpah to get on the train and come here, or wives of surgeons like
Marilla
out here.
Hovey.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Tazewell Patton survives at the college hospital because a nurse sits back to back with him to keep him from lying down because he can't breathe or swallow from his facial injury.
Oh.
And she keeps him alive, whether that was good or bad, I guess you could argue about. But these volunteer women really did amazing work. And really it became the genesis for the whole nursing profession.
And Rick just proved the point. Why does Dorothea Dix hire plain kind of homely looking women and make them wear clothes that don't flatter their figures?
Yeah.
And then Cornelia Hancock was not allowed to come because she was too
too
cute.
pretty.
But she did.
Yeah,
She
she
did.
did.
She did
She
come
just got
down.
on another train.
Yeah.
So when you said, did the young men get horny as they recovered, we just answered that.
I guess so. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. And you're right. They're 23 years old. They're young, and that sometimes overrides pain at that age. So I can see that. Okay. All right. So Fran, you gave us this piece of paper here. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about this. What do we got here? Well, you have here Hancock battlefield nail appointment. Go into that a little bit, please.
Rick, that's yours.
What Fran handed you, Matt, and I think Ron's got a copy of it. I've got a copy. We've done a number of presentations, Fran and I have, where we've outlined the injuries and wounds that some of the more famous people here at Gettysburg, and some not so famous, suffered, with kind of casting a modern day look at their injuries. And one of the people who's most well known that gets injured here is Winfield Scott Hancock. And
Right.
I think most listeners of your show know the story. During Pickett's charge on July 3rd, he's mounted next to the Vermont troops on the southern end of the line when he staggered and falls off his horse. It's caught by a couple of staff men, including, I think, a Vermont staff member, and he has a bullet wound very high up in his, for lack of a medically descriptive term, I'll say his crotch, the groin area. Now, when people hear about groin injuries, it can be anything from a hip joint injury to an injury to the genital area to an injury to the upper thigh. The groin is a very nonspecific term. Hancock was shot literally on the inside. It's an amazing wound, really. On the inside of the inner thigh, and the bullet ranged up and went into his pelvis.
Yes.
Yeah.
That sounds comfortable.
And when the surgeons finally got to him, one of them swept the wound with his finger and pulled a nail out. That's where the nail appointment reference comes from. And I think, was it Hancock himself who famously said, they must be desperate if that's what they're shooting at us.
Yeah.
But there was really no way a tourniquet applied to that could have done very much. So His wound, he survived.
Well, real quick though, on the tourniquet in the movie, he asked for a tourniquet. Is that true that he did?
They did try to put one on, but I can't conceive of how it did anything because of the location of the wound. Very interestingly, it's Winfield Scott Hancock. He makes sure that he's given orders, propped up on an elbow in the back of the wagon as the ambulance as they're taking him off the field. One of the really interesting interactions is that as he's laying on the ground and he's bleeding pretty profusely, one of the staff men looks at him and says, "General, you won't die from this. This isn't arterial blood." This guy's a staff man. He's not a medical guy. And Hancock looks at the guy and says, "Well, thank you, doctor."
At least there's humor. So arterial blood versus what blood?
Venous blood. The unoxygenated blood, you can tell the difference when you look at blood because it's either bright red or it's not so bright red.
Okay.
Venous blood is the low pressure system, arterial is the high. And actually, one of the lectures we did in conjunction...
What's that, Eric?
In conjunction with Ron, we said, Ron, go through your book and give us some people you want us to work up. And one of the people he picked was a Private William March.
Yeah.
You want to tell us about him? Because he's only going to die after... a couple hours after his wounding, and he's a double amputation, I think, right?
He was the guy
from Quebec.
Yeah, he was. Maybe I'm thinking of a different. No, March was the guy who was shot in the peach orchard, and he put tourniquets on each of his legs.
Yeah, that's right.
And then he was 20 or 21 years old, so young, and then he died probably later that day at Spangler.
So he would have arterial bleeding. If your arteries are cut, you can bleed out in about 6 heartbeats.
When that's the difference.
That's the problem with if you get a bullet wound into your heart, if the heart even survives that, 2 pumps. If you get your carotid blown apart, your carotid artery, what do you think? 3, maybe 4.
Maybe.
Like you're going to black out and you're dead. You don't have that reserve.
When you review the medical records of the wounded soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg, particularly in a well-done book like Ron's, you'll see the people who died here at the Spangler Barn died 4 days, 5 days, 2 weeks later. They didn't bleed to death. They bled to death and they're out on the field, or they got hit in the brain and they're dead on the field.
Yeah.
These guys died of infections here. Now, it is possible that an infection can lead to bleeding later on if the existing blood vessels become caught up in the infectious process and basically rot open.
Okay.
That's what happened to one of the Confederate generals, Dorsey Pender, well after this battle. But the difference between dying immediately is your blood vessels are cut or you're shot in the brain. If you even get gut shot, you're going to live for 24 to 48 hours
in misery,
until infection takes you.
Yeah, that's like a bad way to go. So back to Hancock real quick.
Yeah.
So his wound, is it true that they couldn't, at first when they had him laying down, they couldn't quite figure out what exactly the wound was or where the wound was to fix it, and then someone, maybe an orderly, got the bright idea, well, let's put him on his horse, and because that's where he received the wound, and that's the position he was in. Did they do that? Is that true?
That's partly true.
Okay.
So Hancock is actually brought to the Granite Schoolhouse Lane as his first stop, which is on the Spangler property. And then he's ultimately taken home to Philadelphia and Norristown, where he was from. What he developed was what's called osteomyelitis, a bone infection, because the bullet went into his bony pelvis. It is stuck where we sit on. If you put your hand under your butt, you're pushing on a bone. That's called your ischial tuberosity. That's where the bullet is.
Okay.
Now, in the Civil War, they were really consumed with getting the bullet out. I can tell you nowadays, we don't take bullets out unless they're problematic on where they are. It does more damage going after a bullet than just leaving it in there.
Interesting.
But if the bullet is lodged in a joint or in the spinal column, we'll go in and take it out. Months after, I think it was August or September after this July wound, a physician comes to see Hancock at Norristown. And Hancock looks awful, according to the physician. This was Dr. Lewis Wernwag Reed. Wernwag. I'm going to name my next dog Wernwag. And he does exactly what you said. He says, wait a minute, you were on a horse. And he puts him up on a chair and he probes the wound. Because this is a bone infection. It's still open, and it never completely heals in his entire lifetime. But he gets the bullet out that way. Now, taking a bullet out, why does that help? It's less foreign material in an infected wound, so that's good. But once the bone infection is established, it's established, and it's never going to go away.
So, but that obviously didn't kill him because he lived a long time after the battle.
He did. A number of medical issues piled up on Hancock. He became obese, he became diabetic, and he carried a bone infection around with him for a long time, and that's tough on your system.
I would imagine.
He actually dies of an infected boil on the back of his neck. That's what
really?
He gets septic, which is blood poisoning, and you're at risk of that if you're diabetic. Remember, there's no insulin in 1880 when he dies, so diabetics are untreated.
And I have a question. You mentioned blood poisoning, and this is something I've always wondered, and it has nothing to do with the Battle of Gettysburg, but it does have to do with amputations. There's a movie called Lonesome Dove, Book 2, and one of the main characters, played by Robert Duvall, gets his leg amputated because he gets hit with an arrow. And he wakes up, and the doctor wakes up shortly thereafter because he was in a drunken stupor.
I hate it.
And Gus, and he sees Gus, and he goes, "Oh, you're awake. I was hoping to get the other one off before you woke up." And he says, "The blood poison. We got to get the other leg off before the blood poisoning spreads." But there was no wound in the other leg. Is that Hollywood? Why does that make sense in that?
Blood poisoning, which is the same as sepsis,
right,
or septicemia, or there were a number of terms for it at the time of the Civil War, pyemia.
It's not confined to one spot.
No,
if you get blood poisoning, it goes through your whole body. Yeah,
and it comes from dead or devitalized tissue getting infected and then spreading through your system. So the wound in the right leg wouldn't cause blood poisoning to come from the left leg.
Right. So that's
you could
Hollywood.
get blood poisoning, but it wouldn't be from...
But chopping that leg off isn't going to help it.
No.
Yeah.
Modern, this type of, we call it high output failure. You can get so infected that your body can't control your blood pressure.
Right.
So if you think of a hose without a faucet on the end of it and you have your thumb over it, you can get so much poisoning in your body that the thumb comes off and you'll bleed to death, and it's called high output septicemic failure. That probably happened in the Civil War.
Oh, I would imagine.
There's nothing you can do. You can keep trying. You try to hit it with all the big antibiotics, but at that stage, blood poisoning, like everything in medicine, comes in various degrees.
Right.
And the worst would be high output failure from septicemia.
Another one that you have here is, I don't know, this isn't Bayard Wilkeson. This person's last name is Bayard, right? Is that who you're talking about?
I think it's Bayard Wilkeson.
Oh, it is Bayard Wilkeson? All right, let's talk about him because everybody knows that he cut his own leg off with a pocket knife. And then we did an episode with Tim Smith, and I think it was Tim, and he said that's not true. And what do you know about that? And
so let's talk about that. First of all, Rick and I always say that one of the biggest fallacies of care of the wounded is that there's no anesthesia. Look, you can't take a man's arm or leg off by giving him a bullet and a swig of whiskey. Won't work. They have two great anesthetics, ether and chloroform. But your extremity can be so smashed that you have no feeling in there.
Right.
I mean, we've seen some traumas. I want to say corn picker trauma, Rick, where people get their arms cut in corn pickers, and you see this arm that's mangled, and you can touch it. You can touch it with a pin.
Yeah.
And they can't feel a thing. So if Bayard Wilkeson didn't cut his leg off, if it was destroyed bad enough,
he could have.
He could have.
Yeah.
Right. And if the arteries are cut, the arteries of your body have a unique system. You're designed to save your life. The arteries will constrict and try to stop the bleeding. Am I explaining that well enough?
Yeah, they go into what's called spasm, and you would think if a leg is cut off, the stump would be spurting blood.
Right.
That doesn't usually happen.
Yeah.
The arteries spasm and contract off. Now you can't.
They just like pull in?
Yep. And
like the feet of the Wicked Witch when the house falls on her?
Just like that.
Or like an earthworm when you touch it.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right.
But arteries especially have muscles in their wall, and they contract and will spasm. Now, that won't stay that way forever, and they will open up and hemorrhage if you don't get there to tie them off before that happens.
Okay.
But there surely were injuries that were severe enough that a snip might have taken the extremity off.
So when they're amputating and they cut through the arteries, does someone have to grab the artery before
We call
they?
him Rick.
Yeah, it's me.
Yeah, you got to like hold it so that it doesn't retract, right?
Well, you clamp it, and then you put another clamp on, and then you cut it,
Okay.
and then you tie a suture around it before you take the clamp off.
And that's the way they did it then?
Yeah, it would have been.
They had a little device called a tenaculum.
Yes, they would reach in and
If
pull it out.
pulled back in, they would pull it back out. Yeah. And the veins would kind of ooze blood, and the arteries would spurt blood, and they'd have to go in and tie each one up as part
But
of
if
the
you
post.
pack a
Each
vein
one,
long
right.
enough, it'll clot.
Yeah.
Right.
And it acts just like...
It's rare to die from purely venous blood loss. Right. That's why the pseudo doctor who said to Hancock, "You won't die from this, it's venous blood." Thank you, doctor. And if you pack it, that part will usually stop, but not the arterial.
And we all have experience with that. We've all gotten those little cuts, and direct pressure stops them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you ever get, like sometimes shaving, you'll nick an artery, a little facial artery. You got to hold pressure on that for a long time to make it stop.
Or your scalp.
Yeah.
I see this white spot here?
Yeah.
This is from me shaving divots out of this spot in my head twice.
Yeah.
And they bled for days.
Scalps bleed horrific.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's why getting scalped was such a problem.
I looked like Sissy Spacek and Carrie. It was just dripping down my face. It was awful. I had to get that bleed stop, which I highly recommend you. Everybody should have bleed stop around the house. It's great. Okay, so speaking of bleeding and packing wounds and things like that, another thing is lint. What do they use lint for?
It was used a lot out here, Ron, just like any hospital. Basically, to my way of thinking, in modern medical terms, think of 4x4 gauze bandages, and that's the purpose of lint, sir. But it was literally lint. The women, the Sanitary Commission, the Christian Commission would have lint fairs where they took apart blankets and made piles of this stuff, and that's what the surgeons, after they tied off the biggest vessels, they would then pack the wounds with lint. And sometimes they would use wet lint treatments, water bandages, where they would drip water on there. Yeah, water dressings. That's
I was just going to say that if you look at Ron's book in the back, why don't you talk about those? Because you have lots of things listed: water dressing and create resin.
Yeah, it didn't really matter. They used water dressing on just about any wound because that's about all they knew. That no matter how serious, how light it was, they used water dressing where they had a
and
gauze.
we're not talking sterile saline. I mean, this is
No,
water from
this
the
is
barn.
water from the well
Yeah.
on a gauze and maybe some ointment, and that's what they did. And
Rick and I just winced again.
yeah, I think didn't they use lint also in lungs? Dr. Howard or somebody like that tried to hermetically seal lung wounds to try to save them that way, and he didn't have much luck with it. And I think he kind of packed the lungs with lint as well. And
there were two ways to take care of what we call sucking chest wounds. If
Yes.
you get shot in the chest, your chest has negative pressure in it, and so when the air rushes in, it collapses your lung. You have to seal that wound. And the way you could do it is by packing it and then covering it.
Yeah.
The only problem is when you cover an open wound, you've just now set the patient up for a much more likely serious infection because whatever drainage is in there can't come out. And that's why these open wounds and lint packing were all designed to change periodically to lessen the chances of infection.
But other than the non-sterility of lint and water dressings, you're still designed the same way as the soldiers 159 years ago.
Sure.
You have components inside your bloodstream that'll make it clot.
Yeah.
Right.
Clotting cascade, and it needs a framework or a lattice to form on. That's what lint does. That's what bandages do. That's why when you hold direct pressure, what do we tell you? Don't look. Keep holding pressure because that pressure activates all those there's an intrinsic, extrinsic system that makes you stop bleeding. But it's still, it's kind of funny when Rick and I look back, we're still using it. Rick has stuff, he actually has sprays he can spray into your body that are clotting factors. And what do? We hold pressure, and sometimes in the OR when it would get dicey, what do you do, Rick? You pack it.
You pack it.
And hold direct pressure and say, okay, let's let anesthesia catch up. Let's get some blood in here. Let's see what we can do. So other than the sterility, we haven't really advanced much.
Well, I would say it the other way, Fran. Other than the sterility, they knew a lot.
They knew a lot.
We know today.
Yeah,
let's put that straight.
They used so much lint at these hospitals that it was one of the main things donated by women's associations. They need lint.
But now I would imagine they would boil this lint or do something.
Not necessarily, because again, they didn't understand about sterility.
They didn't understand.
So this is just lint. So I take an old blanket from my house and I give it to the lint ladies, and they make lint out of it, and God knows where it goes before it gets into my wound. So that leads me to the question of how resilient is the human body? Because I would think that everyone who is treated by a Civil War doctor should have died, at least by the way we think of things today, where we're walking around with Purell and we put it on everything, even our food. So how resilient is the human body?
Well, the visitor center will tell you 589,000 soldiers survive with their various wounds, amputations.
These are
out of how many total wounded?
720,000 now they're saying died in the Civil War.
So 720,000 that died.
13,000.
13,000. Wait, what? I got lost.
Wait.
You throw out numbers, I get lost.
720,000. I just looked at it because I upped it. 720,000 they now say die in the Civil War. 589,000 survive. So we need to add them together. Just under 1.3 million people were killed and wounded.
So 500,000 survived. Got it. Okay. But go ahead. So what happens?
But these are basically, as we referred to earlier, 23-year-old young men who in many ways are in good health, but also at times not nutritionally in such great health because they've been on the march and they haven't eaten well. But the question you asked, Matt, is how resilient is the human body? It's extremely resilient.
Obviously.
I can tell you, just looking back at my career, I had many accident victims with multiple fractures. And fractures don't kill people, generally speaking. But they would have an abdominal injury. They would have a chest injury, a head injury. And you just shake your head and say, man, there's no way that poor guy's going to make it. But we learned early on in our profession, that's why you do everything for everybody. Because guess what? We can't predict it. I've seen people survive injuries in modern days that you just shake your head and go, man, I don't even know how that happened. And so, the human body is pretty resilient, especially in younger people. But it was a given fact that 80% of people who had surgery in the Civil War of any type were going to get infected because there were no antibiotics. You know who didn't get infected? Dan Sickles. Dan Sickles breezed through his amputation with no evidence of an infection. That's why he's talking to Abraham Lincoln down in D.C. on July 5th, giving him his version of the battle.
Yeah, but his leg was amputated here, right?
Yes.
Not down in. Okay. So wait, you were just talking about something that made me think of another question. Now I forgot it. Go ahead, Ron.
So this farm, like I said, had 1,900 wounded, and many of them in just horrific condition. About 140 men died and were buried here. Now, many men died after they left here, but Civil War medicine saved the vast majority, or the body recovered on its own. Either way, almost everybody here lived. The amputations were horrible. The surgeon's hands weren't sanitized. They had all that working against them, but unless you had a greater than 50% chance survival on just about every type of amputation here.
50% survival on amputations.
Thigh, you had a 54% chance of survival. Knee joint, 57%. Hip joint, you only you had an 83% chance of not surviving. From the hip joint, knee joint, 57%. Thigh. Everything else, your chances are great. there's a high percentage of
amputation was state of the art in 1863.
Sure.
We can't take that away from
No. All right, wait, you said 80% of people who were operated on got infected, right?
Yes.
Do we know the percentage of that 80 that's survived?
Oh, yeah, the vast majority still survive.
So, again, very resilient human body
Yeah.
that we could fight that off without antibiotics or anything.
People may have heard, and this will get distasteful, but it's your podcast. People are used to that.
Exactly.
We've set the lower standard, and we were ready to exceed it.
By all means.
Physicians in the Civil War were students of pus.
Yeah.
Because pus is what happens when things get infected. Many people are familiar with the term laudable pus. What's so laudable about pus? Laudable is something good. Laudable pus means that the infection you have is being caused by a bacteria that probably won't kill you. Other types of pus, Icarus pus, there were other descriptors, would more likely become blood poisoning or sepsis and lead to a bad outcome. So,
how do you tell the difference?
Appearance, smell, the consistency of it.
So laudable pus would be what? Clear
light,
and
creamy,
okay.
And it's from a staph infection, basically.
Okay.
And the other types of infection from strep bacteria are more likely to run through your body and kill you. Yeah. That's what the flesh-eating bacteria that we still occasionally read about now are.
That's my biggest
fear.
fear.
And they didn't tighten up the wound so the pus would escape.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I wanted to see that.
Many times, infection will find its way out of your body.
Yeah.
I mean, you can sew it up nice and tight, but if there's an infection, it'll open up and it'll drain itself.
And then there's just some people who are just damn lucky. And I showed this. Ron gave us a private named William Furlong, Company G, 153rd Pennsylvania, wounded out in the first day's battlefield, wounded in the head, and they think he's dead. They think he's a corpse. And then he wakes up.
Oh, yes.
And he's
4 days later.
4 days later.
Yes,
Hey,
yes.
what's going on? And they bring him out here to the barn. And it looks like he dies again. And then in the rain, this is the guy that's under the rain gutter that's washing his wound out. And he wakes up again.
And he's got water pooling on his brain.
But it's clearing the infection.
Yeah.
So you can see his brain.
You can see it. Yeah. So there's people like that. We have, who's the general that gets both eyes shot out? Gabriel Paul. Yeah. So the human body is an incredibly complex and phenomenal machine.
It really is. Now, you were talking about hip joint amputation. How difficult is that to amputate from the hip joint?
An amputation, Ron's statistics reflect this. The closer the amputation is to your torso,
the worse it is.
The more likely you're going to die.
Right.
The lower extremity amputations have a higher death rate than upper extremity amputations. But if you take someone's arm off near the shoulder, like Stonewall Jackson had done, that's more likely to result in death than if you get a finger taken off.
Right.
In the lower extremity, if you amputate through the hip joint, and that's called a hip disarticulation. You're taking the hip joint out of the body.
I actually know that word.
Okay, disarticulation.
Yes.
It's different than an above-knee amputation.
All right.
And they're very rarely done nowadays, mostly for tumor. It almost was an unsurvivable operation in the Civil War. One of the famous names here, John Bell Hood, had a very high above-knee amputation in September after his femur was shattered at the Battle of Chickamauga. And by rights, he should have died of that wound. That carried a mortality rate of 80-some%, but he survived it.
What a year for that guy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, just a few months, really.
Yeah.
He's the Monty Python guy.
Yeah, I'm not quite dead
Not
yet.
quite dead.
It's only a flesh wound. Can't
And
even
also,
talk.
I mean, as we're talking too, when you read through Ron's book, he does an excellent listing of what happened. But you see soldiers that you see things like Private Henry Webb, 17th Connecticut. He dies of exhaustion and fatigue. And Rick and I look at that and say, I don't know, is that post-traumatic stress disorder? Is it desperation? I mean, we know there's soldiers that commit suicide on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Those types of stuff are just mystifying.
Well,
Yeah.
I think there's a medical reason for that I know that's what's listed on their death certificates, but you don't die of exhaustion. Yeah. You might die of kidney failure from dehydration because you're not getting enough fluid.
Or
Armistead doesn't die of a broken heart. I mean, there are medical reasons people die, and exhaustion and depression.
But I found that a broken heart is an actual medical condition. Something about a sinus or something like that?
There's a condition called commodio mortis where
that's it, yeah.
You're hit in the chest and your heart just quivers and you die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned PTSD and suicide, though, and you have Upton here on your list.
Yes. Emory Upton's here at Gettysburg. Not involved much in the action. He's got the monument on the
Little Round Top.
Yeah, the northern slope of Little Round Top. Emory Upton,
Colonel of the 121st New York.
Yeah, and a big thinker. And Emory Upton is known as having suicide. That's what they say. He'll commit suicide at the Citadel years after the war. And of course, every psychological paper says, "Oh, he committed suicide." So I don't know. So we started looking because we said it's a post-traumatic stress. Emory Upton's medical background is quite interesting. From the time at West Point, he complains of this headache. And we see doctors who are using stethoscopes of the day, and they're listening, and they can hear something sloshing around over his left eye. But it doesn't go with his heartbeat. So they thought it was an aneurysm, but it's not making the noise with the heartbeat. He continues and continues to work with this. He has chronic, I love the word, Rick, catarrh.
Catarrh. That's again a medical term. It means a runny nose.
Okay.
Chronic catarrh.
Okay.
And he's just not getting better. Now he's going to marry, and he's going to have a wife that's going to die, and he can't get to her side in March. But he's going to continue to.
And this is well after the
Civil War.
Right.
So everybody's saying, no, that's why he committed suicide. He's working up a paper where you can predict the outcome of battles by just counting how many captains side A has versus B, how many lieutenants. And the French prove that that's all just a bunch of hooey. So he's got a lot of things going on. And one day the Citadel, and it was in San Francisco, either on a Sunday night or early Monday morning. Presidio, right. San Francisco. He puts acute lead poisoning and kills himself. Now this is kind of like bugging us because it sounds like post-traumatic stress. So Rick and I were blessed to work with trauma surgeons and ENT docs, so I gave this all to the ENT doc, and he looked it over and he said, he had a cautery of his nose before he went out to the coast. I said, yeah. And he said, and the catarrh stopped. The cautery, they went in with a hot wire and burnt the inside of his nose. So the runny nose stopped.
That must have been great. Oh, my God.
Well, but the problem is, he said, I think he has a pseudocyst in his frontal sinus.
Well, I was going to say brain tumor.
No, that's what they couldn't find. It didn't mean a brain tumor. It was just this chronic pain. He's in chronic pain. Rick taking lots of narcotics,
right.
Not sleeping. And now this catarrh, the runny nose has stopped, but the pressure's blowing up in his brain, and he said it's a pseudocyst. And there's a guy in Lancaster in 1963 who said the same thing. So it's hard.
What is that technically?
It's a fluid-filled cyst that
in your sinus.
That basically forms.
So basically, they cauterize the sinuses so it can't run, but it just backs up.
That's correct.
And then he said, and it probably erodes into his brain, or erode into his brain, and that pain. You think the tissue around the bone is painful. The tissue around your brain is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And he also they say suicides occur around rainy weather, San Francisco.
Yep.
Sundays and Mondays. Around recent traumatic events, he buried his wife a year from the following time. He's had some type of emotional jolt. So it's the post-traumatic stress people says, it was from the war. It's everything in medicine. It's a combination of things. But above it all is a chronic pseudocyst. And how would you treat that today? Dr. Rogerson said, we put you asleep, we cut a flap under your eyeball, we lift under your eyelid, we lift up the skin, we drill in with the thing, suck it all out, and you're back at work the next day.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's what happened to him.
It's amazing how far we've come.
Matt, you bring up one of the really interesting and I think timely topics that's being written more and more about in the Civil War medical literature, which are the wounds that you can't see.
Yeah.
And the mental health issues,
yeah.
And how that morphs off into substance abuse, alcoholism, spousal abuse.
Withdrawal, depression.
If you look at the admission records at mental health facilities after the Civil War, it skyrockets.
Yeah.
Because these men are dealing with what Ron's book talks about that's visible, but the invisible stuff is going on for all of these poor guys.
And Ron, I'm going to ask you, do you see any of that in the Spanglers? What happens 5
great
to
question.
10 years after?
None of the 6 original Spanglers had any issues like that I know of. But down to the grandkid level, they had a grandson-in-law hang himself up here at a farm on Blacksmith Shop Road.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Really?
He was having financial difficulties. And another grandson-in-law had shot himself in a hunting accident, and he had gone blind, and he ended up killing himself too. So I don't think the Spanglers ever recovered from the nightmare that they lived through. They lost some kids and family members who just died, so they went through so much. But I don't, not except down to the grandkid level, they just didn't show it with that kind of thing.
Wouldn't you just love to know, like, what went through their heads when they stepped onto this thrashing floor?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, we know there's blood stains on some of these boards and
Yeah,
stuff.
these are original boards,
These
most
are the
of them.
original boards, so we know there are blood stains on here, but you gotta, I don't know, how do you put that behind yourselves?
I don't know that you ever do.
Well, did they left here, right?
No.
They stayed?
They stay.
Well, they stayed the whole time, the whole 5 weeks.
No. I mean, after. Didn't you say there were connections in Kansas or something that you found?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You're thinking their third child, Daniel.
Okay, he left.
He left and moved to Kansas.
But
I
he
don't
just
know when.
moved.
Right.
He just, you know what he actually did is he moved the River Brethren out there, this religious group.
Oh, really?
He drove a wagon out there to Kansas and made 2 trips out there, and I guess he liked it so much he stayed out
stayed.
The
there.
scenery's beautiful.
Yeah. He actually he homesteaded.
Never
He
been.
was given
Oh, really?
320 acres by the federal government, 160 acres of timberland, and 160 of farmland. He lived in the dugout.
Wow.
A little dugout into a hill, and that was his home. Then he moved to a little town called Enterprise. The worst thing that the Spanglers really faced, other than what happened to them during the battle, was when George died at age 88. He died in January. In March, his oldest daughter, Harriet, died, and then a few days later, Harriet's daughter died. So Elizabeth lost her husband, a daughter, and a granddaughter in about 2 months. Wow. So, and Elizabeth ended up dying in the building that's now Mr. G's Ice Cream because Benaiah owned all or part of that. So.
But let me I'm going to
Can't wait to get a cookie dough ice cream cone.
So this is July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. One of the coolest things that you can ask this man to do, and I'm pointing to Ron Kirkwood, is to say, I don't want to hear any more about the hospital. How was this place used tactically? It's been one of the best things. We don't think about this farm as big as it is. Ron, can you give 5 minutes on the first 3 days of the battle when you give that scenario? This is a tactical piece of ground.
Yeah, and all I did was look at a Batchelder map, and that showed me where everyone was on this farm. So you get the 5th Corps coming in here on the morning of July 2nd. They're here all day till they get ordered. They're over by Rock Creek and Granite Schoolhouse Lane, and they're on some Spangler farm, and they're on the Musser farm. They get orders late in the day, get to the line. So part of the 5th goes down Granite Schoolhouse Lane, part goes down Blacksmith Shop Road. Why do they get to Little Round Top so quickly? To save the day as the Confederates are rushing up? Because they're at Spangler Farm, which is right behind Little
That
Round
means
Top.
Joshua Chamberlain was here.
He was here.
Good point.
And everybody who was important in the 5th Corps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did have to use a picture of him because everybody knows Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. They're not gone long, and the 6th Corps moves in. And then they're ordered to the line, and they rush down Granite Schoolhouse Lane. Later that night, a division of the 12th Corps is ordered off of Culp's Hill. They rush down Granite Schoolhouse Lane, and they get to the line so quickly because this is 166 acres. It's huge. It dominates the countryside behind the line. The left flank it's close to the left flank. It's close to the center. It's close to the right flank. The artillery reserve arrives out here within feet of where we're sitting 106 cannons, 2,300 men, 2,300 horses. Whenever there is a possible break in the line, Meade or somebody says, get some artillery reserve batteries out there. And they do. And they're fighting at the peach orchard, all over Wheatfield Road, the Trossel Farm, the Plum Run line. They're fighting at Cadore, Cemetery Hill, East Cemetery Hill. The artillery reserve is fighting on Powers Hill, which the Spangler zone. The ammunition train arrives. This ammunition train is 100 wagons, hundreds of men, and hundreds of mules. They provide all of the ammunition to all of the artillery in the Army of the Potomac. So they're here on July 2nd. They're going out all day to the line. The night of July 2nd, artillery batteries from all over the line are coming here to Spangler to reload. So the ammunition train arrives on the 2nd with, 24,000 rounds, I think. When they leave this farm on the 3rd, they have 4,000 rounds left. Wow. So nobody slept here on the night of July 2nd because there were batteries coming all the time. Again, this was the location. There's artillery and infantry on Powers Hill. There's artillery and infantry on the west side of the farm. There's a signal station with the flags flying on Powers Hill. Slocum makes Powers Hill his headquarters, top and bottom. Meade comes here. He's bombed out of the Leicester house. He watches Pickett's charge from the George Spangler farm. And then in the morning and overnight, he's camped here on Powers Hill on the George Spangler farm. Finally got flooded out with the NOAA floods on July 4th. This farm was the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg because of the way it's set up.
Yeah, and
the Army of the Potomac win. Yeah. And Meade saw a lot of this. He did a lot of this. He got here late, but he put a lot of these men in this position to win like that. So I don't know if Meade gets enough credit for that, but I will always give him enough credit for that.
And all this is going on while we're trying to save men's lives.
Right.
Exactly.
It's like you sit here, there's no overall command of this farm. There's no...
Well, there's a surgeon in charge
here, but there's
he's not having anything to do with the ammunition train.
They're probably saying, "Get the hell out of our
artillery reserve."
We're going to pack you.
And there's 100 ambulances. Oh, by the way, George has 2 wheatfields, and there's 100 ambulances on his wheatfields. Although eventually a lot of them moved up to East Cemetery Hill because that's where the 11th Corps was. So there was no open space on this farm.
It's so hard to imagine all that. But you're right. It's like Grand Central Station. Is everything going on here?
And just because of the size or because of the roads? When I look at
the
this,
location.
location's everything.
Other farms
location.
saw dramatically more combat than this farm. This farm saw very little. Rose, Henry Spangler, all of them, Bliss, they're destroyed.
Yeah.
But no farm was more important than setting up that win than this farm with everything that George Meade and the generals put here, and in addition to the lives that they saved here with 2 hospitals. Yeah. So how the Spanglers ever recovered from that, because the barn and everything was basically destroyed. That must have impacted them for the rest of their lives. They must have thought about that every single day, what they had to live through and what they survived.
How could you not? Especially if these are the original floorboards and there's blood stains on them and stuff. I mean,
60% of the wood up here is original. We have wood up here that's from the log cabin barn that George recycled when they purchased the property in 1848. That's from a 1700s log cabin. Wow, really? Now on the first floor,
this beam here. I'm sorry, you guys can't see. There's a beam over Matt.
Please don't let it fall on me.
And there's more beams downstairs too. Weak. 90% of the wood downstairs was here when the men were lying in this barn. So this is historic wood. This is witness wood.
And what kind of was he? Just a crop farmer? Did he have animals?
He had livestock, right?
He did. He had 13 horses. He had dairy cattle, beef cattle, chickens, sheep, hogs. He had it all, and he had corn, wheat, hay, oats, garden vegetables.
Had an orchard.
Had an orchard, mainly a peach orchard. There were some apple trees in it too. He was doing well. Yeah. He bought 80 acres here in 1848. And by 1863, he's grown it to 166 acres. Every single time land became available, he bought it. Yeah. All the land north of Granite Schoolhouse Lane was for sale in 4 segments, but he bought all 4 segments, 65 acres.
And he was really kind of a pillar of the community, too.
He
Wasn't
was.
he very involved with the education process? That's why there's a schoolhouse on his property.
He was chairman of the Cumberland Township School Board, so he hired the teachers at the one-room schoolhouses. He donated the land in the middle of the farm, like Rick said, so the schoolhouse could be built there. He was an elder in his church.
Right.
He was a justice of the peace. He was on the committee that inspected the poorhouse, the almshouse, every year. He was even on the Evergreen Cemetery board that voted unanimously not to allow any Confederates to be buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Elizabeth was a caring, thoughtful woman. She was one of 9 or 10 kids. She kind of took in her dad, and then he's actually buried right next to them. So,
and no written diaries of them. No. I mean, man, there's a guy that's like Dean Schultz. He would love to say, "Let's talk."
I've been working on Dean Schultz.
Yeah, we all are.
Yeah. So, and you guys checked in the floorboards and everything back in the house? There's nothing hidden in there? Diaries, no letters, nothing?
Pickets orders, probably.
His official report.
Tickets report. Yeah.
One of the reasons I started contacting Spangler Descendants is I wanted to know who they were. I didn't go farther down than grandkids, but it was also selfish. I wanted pictures. I had a picture of Benaiah, who's the youngest son. I didn't have a picture of Daniel, but I did find that on my own, and I did find a bad one of Harriet on my own. But, and I'm going to show you guys this afterward, Descendants Day, when I had 60-some descendants here from all over the country, California, Florida, everywhere, great-great-grandson of George and Elizabeth through Daniel, this great-great-grandson who lived in Kansas, because that's where Daniel moved, who now lives in South Carolina. He brought a photo of George and Elizabeth Spangler. Oh, wow. I now know what they look like, and so I verified it, and it's been dated as the 1860s. So you guys will see it today, and hopefully anybody listening will see it in the near future.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I got to tell you, Ron, we interpreting the battlefield depend on people like you.
Yeah.
You add to our story. You allow us to bring the time closer when you stand out there.
Yeah. And if you haven't gotten a hold of Ron's book, you need to get a hold of it because it's very good. All right, so let's wrap up the whole medical situation for the good old townspeople of Gettysburg and the surrounding areas. How long do they have to deal with their bleeding guests? Bleeding and pus-filled guests.
Most of them were picked up by the 5th. By the time...
From here? Or from
the battlefield.
Yeah, the 11th Corps ambulances went out, and they got all their 11th Corps guys.
Gotcha,
I don't think there was anybody in houses. Was there after the 5th?
Well, I think there still were.
Were there?
Because there were 160 buildings that became hospitals here.
Yeah.
But
some whole blocks were like complexes, hospital complexes.
Yeah, now they may only have
churches.
2 or 3 wounded in the house. But, Ron, you said this place closed in 5 weeks?
5 weeks and 2 days. August 7th, there were no other wounded men.
The 2nd Corps Hospital on the Jacob Schwartz farm out by the outlets closed about the same time. The injured were consolidated after about 5 or 6 weeks into about 2 or 3 locations. The seminary hospital stayed open a long time. Camp Letterman didn't close until the day after Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, November 20th.
Okay.
And I believe the school up on High Street was a long-standing hospital. But you can imagine these collections of 2 and 3 patients get put together into more centralized locations for improved care. How long did it take the town to get over it?
We're still getting over it.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's true.
I mean, one of the real concerns the townspeople had in Gettysburg is, are we going to get sick from this?
Right.
And
do we know? Did they?
There might be some work. Didn't you talk about somebody who was doing research about cholera in the Willoughby Run area?
No, but there were, and somebody needs to do a study on this, and I don't know if it's us or somebody out there. Like George Spangler's sister died 2 months afterward, and there was a lot of that with the water and tanneries and stuff and their chemicals. Lots of people were dying within months of the battle. Young people. She was in her 30s. So that's a area of further study.
And even the legacy to children born. Elizabeth Thorne, was, of course, pregnant at the time of the battle, and her child, when she's born, who she names Rose Mead Thorne, dies at 4 or 5 years of age and was always a sickly child.
Yeah.
So that brings my next question then. So I'm not from here. You guys aren't from here either. Are you from here? No. So none of us are from here. And amongst other transplants, there's a question of all the bullets, they're made of lead, and they're in the ground, and, that gets into the water.
Absolutely.
And might that explain some of the people we bump into in the modern day?
It explains all the people that like Gettysburg, probably.
Well, yeah, but except we don't have families that have been here for generations. And with all due respect to the multi-generational families in the area, did the lead in the water or in the ground seep into the water and have an effect on people?
I don't know the answer to that.
We don't know,
think if lead was an issue in the drinking system, it more likely came from the pipes. Just like it has in other places like Flint, Michigan.
Yeah.
But again, they're just hitting all around this bacteria. Horses and people are going and urinating around water supplies and dead animals. What's a dead animal? Where do they find them? By the water hole.
Yeah.
Because they're dehydrated. They want water. So now the horse, there's 2 horses in the stream. That contaminates the water. They're just, Rick, it's almost sad when you read the magazines. Man, they're all around it. They know about malaria. They know about, but they don't.
They haven't figured out bacteria for
It's
another
coming.
10 or 15
It's
years.
coming.
Malaria. Is that where we get malaria from?
Correct.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. Well, so when it's all said and done, when does Camp Letterman close?
November 20th.
November 20th. Oh,
After
you
the
said that
battle,
before. Yeah, I'm sorry. And then this is done in 5 weeks here. For the most part, by the end of the year, by New Year's Day of '64, are all the wounded gone from
I would say
Gettysburg?
pretty much, yeah.
They've gone on either back into the service or back home or
into the ground.
into the ground.
They're in the better hospitals. They're in the brick and mortar hospitals
Right,
and
right.
in the
bigger
cities. Yeah. Okay.
That's one of the reasons Camp Letterman had to close. Winter's coming.
Yeah, because they're intense.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, this was great as always. Thank you very much for doing this.
pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. All right. There we are.
That was fun.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Garry, Owen, and Glory. Instead of spa, drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man for debt shall go to jail from Garry, Owen, and Glory. Instead of spa, drink down